listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
What is going on? Happy New Year. Welcome to 2025 and how have you been? I really hope you're doing good and thank you for checking out the very first episode of the show this year. So how was your Christmas break? Hope it was okay. You got some rest and time with family and friends. I managed to get a little bit of downtime, but things were pretty frantic right up until Christmas Eve. Then all the usual Christmas stuff where you don't know what day it is, and then I was into let loose rehearsals and a New Year's Eve show with a band in London, which was fun, but I was pretty beat up after all of that, and I've been trying to play a little catch up since. I've been making it a point to try and watch some films that have totally passed me by over the years. Kind of films which had amazing reviews, but for some reason I didn't check them out back in the day, so that's been really fun, watching films 20 or 30 years old with fresh eyes. So far I've managed to catch up on A Few Good Men, Boogie Nights and The Usual Suspects, all of which I loved. And if you like, I'll keep you up to date on any more I find out, because there's lots more, believe me. So here we are with the first show of 2025, and I did this chat just before Christmas, so there's a couple of mentions during the conversation, but it was really cool to welcome bassist Phil Soussan to the show. Phil has had an incredible career. Born and raised in London, he will begin his professional career playing with the likes of Simon Kirke of Bad Company and Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin. Not a bad start. Before he was spotted by none other than Ozzy Osbourne and invited to relocate to the USA as part of his band. Phil would bring with him the hit single Shot in the Dark and score a massive worldwide hit. Following his time with Ozzy, Phil will go on to work with Vince Neil of Motley Crue, assembling Vince's solo band for the Exposed album and writing a bunch of songs for that LP. And today he can be found both on stage with Last in Line and also behind the production desk writing and producing for bands. We chat all about his amazing career, but if you'd like to find out more, you can connect with Phil at philsoussan.com or find him on Instagram simply at Phil Soussan. But right now, please enjoy my straight to video chat with the man himself, bassist, songwriter and producer, Phil Soussan.
Hello.
Hello, sir. How's your day going? I guess you're still kind of midday over there, right?
Yeah, it's noon. So, lots of early morning stuff and a little bit of running around and trying to get some errands done, last minute holiday shopping doing. And I'm sure same problem for everybody right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Where are you? Are you in Vegas or Hollywood? Whereabouts are you?
Oh, I'm in Las Vegas right now. I was in LA yesterday. I had to go to LA for the day, which is, to those not familiar, is a extremely drab 4-hour drive there and back. But it's not difficult to do. You can just jump in the car and you can go to LA, which is nice. You just go through Death Valley. Sounds very dramatic, don't it? Death Valley. So,
yeah. How does an American Christmas compare to the old UK Christmases you had growing up?
It's a lot less of a performance over here. I think that Thanksgiving is probably a bigger deal than Christmas. At least from the point of view of families and stuff, they tend to want to get together on Thanksgiving and people will travel around the country. Christmas tends to be like, okay, great. And we give some gifts and then sit down, have a meal and then, and then the day after Christmas, there's no Boxing Day. Everyone goes back to work.
I've got family in Mississippi. It wasn't until the mid-90s when I spent a Christmas there. And I couldn't believe the day after Christmas, it's gone.
It's all done.
We like to hang it on over here for a while.
I know it. Over there, they start Christmas at pretty much beginning of December and then they finish it at the end of the next November. So it's, they draw it out a bit is what I'm saying,
Absolutely. How often do you make it back to the UK now?
I used to go back about 3 times a year on average. But since the pandemic, that's all changed. And I haven't actually been back for a while, but I'm trying to go back maybe this year, beginning of this year. There's a lot of Brits who live here in Vegas and we were at a party the other day. I was talking with some of them and I said, I think I'm going to try to go back in January, I think. They said, January? It's bloody freezing. And I went, okay, February then.
When you do return to the UK, either on tour or holiday, being in London, everywhere is so different nowadays. So many venues have gone, but I'm sure that's the same out in Hollywood and Vegas, specifically Hollywood. Everyone says it's just hotels now and all the iconic things are slowly fading away.
Yeah, America's pretty good at destroying any history that they have. No offense to Americans or anything, but it just seems to be that everything gets torn out and rebuilt with new stuff all the time. So it's usually quite difficult to find places that are really old. And when you do find them, that it's usually quite special. Whereas, growing up in Britain, from the time you're a toddler walking around, you walk around buildings that are 300 years, 400 years old. And there's a sense of security that you get, a sort of spiritual security that you're somewhere of permanence, if that makes any sense. And that's something I miss about Britain.
Definitely. I mean, is there anything, the old special memories back home, like venues and things like that? Because I don't suppose Blank's Music is still on Kilburn High Road where you got your first bass. Is that long gone?
Blank's Music. Wow. I found the receipt for that recently.
What?
Because we were moving over here. I have two houses, we have a house in LA and a house here. So we were actually moving into this place and getting a bunch of stuff over. And as you start packing stuff you haven't been through for ages, all of a sudden I came across this receipt from Blank's Music Store. I spent most of my time standing outside of Blank's Music Store pulling this face. Looking through the glass at all of these incredible guitars, which actually just looking at them was enough to get you excited, back then, let alone picking one up. I mean, you couldn't go into that store and say, hey, can I try out that Rickenbacker? They would look to you like you're nuts. You're not buying that.
What were the people who worked there like? Was they cool and hip, or was they kind of old school?
I don't know if it was Mr. Blanks or whatever, but he was an older guy and he was a little cantankerous and stuff. And you kind of had to have a legitimate reason to be in that store, that you were going to be a potential buyer before you could even walk in the door. That's how I was made to feel. So I studied classical violin. And so I had a legitimate reason to go in there and buy some rosin or buy a set of strings. So for that, I felt quite comfortable. But if I was going to go in there and in walking up to the counter, happened to glance at a Strat hanging on the wall, it'd be like, hey, what are you looking at? So nothing. So it was intimidating.
So when you did buy the bass that day, had you specifically gone out to buy a bass that day? Had you been saving up for one in particular?
Saving up for one for a long time, clutching, I forget, it was £20 or £21 or something. And I went in there and I bought a bass and a Strat. And I remember that when I got the bass, it was tuned very, very high. It was a short scale bass. And I thought, without knowing, I was like, oh, that seems a bit high, but whatever. I tuned it up. As I went to tune the E string up, the machine head broke off in my hand. Turns out the bass was actually tuned almost an octave higher.
Wow. Like the neck was probably like Boeing because it's so tight.
Shaped like this. Yeah. So I went back there and I said, and it was a very stressful experience. I explained to him that the thing was tuned too high. He accused me of doing it. I said, well, we somehow came to an arrangement. He agreed to change the machine head for a nominal amount, for which I was very grateful. And then we tuned it back to where it was supposed to be tuned.
You've still got the receipt, but whatever happened to the bass?
I have no idea.
No?
I don't know if I sold it to somebody. I might have sold it to somebody, or if it just, I was just trying to remember my second bass that I ever bought, and it just popped into my head the other day. It was made by Arbiter. It looked like an SG bass. First one was a small scale. This one went to a medium scale. I don't know what happened to that one either. After that is when I bought my first real bass, and I remember all the details about that one.
Which one was the first real one?
It was actually one of the original Music Man Stingrays, made in 1974. I sold it to one of my best friends at the time. He still has it. I've been trying to buy it back from him ever since.
But at least you know where it is.
At least I know where it is.
Did the role of the bass guitar make sense to you right away in its place in the band? Because a lot of us perhaps sometimes buy a bass to play in a band, or did you understand its role between the link between the drums and the guitars and things like that?
Yeah, I absolutely did. Thanks to my classical education. When you study classical music, you study basically from Bach. And a lot of what Bach did was often referred to as figured bass, where everything is defined by the bass line and the relationship with the melody line. And then the chords that go in between are sometimes subject to interpretation, that being almost a basis for jazz and stuff like that. But there is a definite correlation between these two things. And they were both things that really spoke to me. The melody line spoke to me, the bass line spoke to me. And I think it's a reason why you see so much an incredible aspect to those people who sing and play bass at the same time. And it's the McCartneys, and it's the Geddy Lees, and it's the Stings, and it's all those people. There's a quality that you can see that they really have cemented that relationship between those two elements. So that means a lot to me. Playing bass has always been a very melodic thing for me. I'm not trying to just play the chords. I'm not just trying to play rhythm. I'm trying to find lines that carry and relate to the melody as well. And that makes it a very interesting process.
How do you find like the singing and playing? Is it something you took to quite well?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. I play guitar as well. And it's definitely more challenging, I think, than playing guitar. You play guitar, you strum. It's a rhythmic thing. You sing along to it. Sometimes you play lines as well. Some people are really good at it. But playing bass, exclusively, you're playing lines. lines and you're singing a different line. And a lot of the time it's easy for me to separate the two, but even I find myself in a position where, I have to sit down and literally slow something down and go over it and over it until it almost becomes a motor reflex if the melody line that I'm singing is different.
You spoke about taking up the bass guitar, but you've also spoke about getting into the medical profession at college, but chose the music route. Was there anything that pushed you in that direction? Was it heart over head, or perhaps did you think back then that music had a time limit, so you had to grab hold of that whilst you could?
It was purely down to passion. It was the amount of time that I was spending doing both. Anyone who knew me growing up I was a complete, what they call here, a nerd. I mean, I had chemistry set when I was about 7 years old. I loved electronics. I was building things. I was tinkering. I loved physics, sciences, math, all that stuff. It was very, very easy to me. And so when I finally went to do my O-levels and then my A-levels and everything else, it was like falling off a log. It wasn't that difficult for me to do. And I would find myself doing my homework or whatever it was on the condition that if I got that out the way, then I could spend hours and hours playing. And it just got to the point, I think, where one day I sort of was forced to ask myself the reasons why I was doing everything. When it came to music, the reason was passionate. It was, I loved doing this. This is what I love doing. This is what everything else is designed to get me to do, is to get me to a place where I have some time to be able to do music. And so that right there made my sense. Passion is the only reason to get into music, because it's definitely not something you get to make money or to,
You speak a lot about setting attainable goals, which I think it's great advice. Rather than saying you want to, as soon as you've picked up a guitar, I want to sell out arenas or sell millions of albums. You take one thing at a time, one gig at a time, and steadily build your career. Was that something you learned very early on, or was that advice you got from someone?
No, I don't think I did get that advice from anyone. I think it's something I figured out just because when I started, I said, okay, one day I said, okay, this is it, music. I'm not doing anything else. Once I got over the repercussions of that decision as it was related to certain people like parents and stuff, the next thing was, okay, well, what am I going to do now? Okay, well, I know what I want, but how do I get there? And it almost became like a disciplined thing where I said, well, if I can accomplish something every day, then I can go to bed feeling good that I've done something that's moving it forward. It was just an extension of that. It was just a bit of a self-discipline thing. But I knew that if I tried to set some goal that I wouldn't get, that disappointment might discourage me.
Right, I've not thought of it in that way.
And so I was terrified of that. I said, I don't want to be discouraged. Everyone knows what failure is like. Everyone knows, doing something doesn't work out, and then all of a sudden you feel horrible about it. You feel horrible. And sometimes it's difficult then to get excited about the next step. So here, if you can just do little things that mean something. Look, I want to write a song. That's not an inattainable goal. And I'm going to try to write a song in a month. And if you do that and you come out with it and say, wow, I wrote this song in a month. Well, how about I try to write 2 songs next month? You're actually encouraged. I can do this, So it's a good thing. I think it's a great lesson across whatever business you happen to be in.
Totally. Yeah, you can translate that not just to music, to any kind of
absolutely
walk of life, really.
And I love encouraging people. I talk to people all the time, younger people, always. I was always part of a lot of these rock and roll fantasy camps and a lot of these kind of things where you interact with people who want to get advice from people who have been successful or have been working well. And I think it's fantastic to encourage people. And you just see people who are just, sponges because they're so passionate about what they want to do. They're just looking for some encouragement and something to make them feel good. So they walk away and they say, wow, now I'm really excited. I really want to do this. I want to get into it.
Do you have to teach patience as well to them as well? Because people want it instantly these days.
Patience?
Like, you can get there, but it might take a while.
Yeah, you're right. No one has any patience, but forever it's taken, it takes 20 years to become an overnight sensation, So I think it's always taken a little bit of patience. And the problem is that when somebody does achieve a level of success, everybody sort of hears about it overnight. And that, that can take a lot of preparation to get to. I mean, I have friends who's a magician. And when you hear his story, how he's come up through this business, it's a lot of work.
One thing I've spoken about with other bass players who are perhaps, I was heavily influenced by like the 80s rock bands which you've played with and things like that. But during the 60s, 70s and early 80s, the bass, it was always very prominent in the mix. But as productions got bigger and bigger, you kind of had to train your ear to pick out the bass lines. But your work in particular, especially with Ozzy, you're right up there in the mix. Did you ever have any say in how punchy the bass was?
None at all. No, I used to butt heads with the producer on that album, Bron Neverson.
But it's up there though. It's like, did you just wear him down eventually?
No, I didn't. I think it was just, listen, I think it's, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, about all of this. At that time, it was like, look, this is all being taken care of by these professionals and that's what's happening. The only thing I can control is my sound. So I think that's a very big part of it. The sound that I have with Last in Line is a sound which I finally feel is really how I want it to be, because a lot of the stuff that we do is almost self-produced. So I'm able to find the sound that I want, and I produce a lot as well. So I'm always a little wary as a bass player when I go into productions, when I do mixes. Sometimes I come away and say, Jesus, that bass too loud, because I'm fearful that I'm going to naturally want to push that louder. But it tends to be the other way. Usually somebody will come up and say, can you push the bass a little louder? It sounds good there, but we're not really hearing it as much. The sound is what cuts through, not the volume.
I guess what you play as well, going back to what you said about the melody lines and things like that, where a lot of us will just stick to the root and stuff. But if you're finding those little pockets to add those different melodies and feels, it is going to cut through in the mix and people are going to hear it. So it might be part of that as well, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you've got a melody line that's singing and then between breaths, you're answering the phrase, then it's naturally going to find its own placement. So yes, from an audio spectral point of view, that's something that's naturally going to happen. You know, I did some work for a while as a music film re-recording mixer. At one point, I was debating whether I wanted to just go and do feature film. Then I started working with some really big guys, big film studios, worked with Rick Klein and Gary Bourgeois, and these are people who do top level films. The funniest things was when they finally get to assemble the movie, which is the 11th hour of the whole process, it's probably the first time the sound effects team has met the music team, has met the dialogue team, and are in the same room together. And the tempers, it comes down to managing a room full of heated tempers and very little to do with technical work. But what was funny is when you pull the scene up, let's say you get to a car wreck, right? Everybody is throwing the kitchen sink at it. There's people screaming, there's sound effects going, there's music going, and you can't put it all together. You have to say, well, what's important here? You know, is the sound effect the important thing, or is the people screaming the important thing, or is the music build up? And everybody's fighting for dominance at that one particular moment in time. And beautiful arrangements come where everything has naturally found its own place and built a really nice dynamic through the song.
Do you need a producer in that situation as well? Someone just to calm the flames?
In the film world?
Yeah.
I think in the film world, you really need to control the personalities more than anything. From the re-recording mixer's point of view, probably thinking, you know, the most important thing here is probably the sound effects. So the music builds up and the music stops, and then screams, maybe. Someone will turn around and say, you know what, I'm going to actually mute all the sound effects. So you get the music building up and the screams building up, and all of a sudden it goes silent, and all you hear is the screams, or all you hear is nothing. All of these things are relevant. And same thing when you're arranging music as a producer, you want to build these moments up in the song so that, you know, you're really bringing the most impact that you possibly can. And a lot of it sounds very complicated, but just sit back and listen and say, is this really giving me the impact when it gets to the chorus? Can I improve it? That's all.
Your gig with Ozzy came after a real string of, let's go back to those goals and stepping stones we mentioned earlier. You've previously been working with Simon Kirke of Bad Company. Was that when you felt things were gaining momentum with your career, when a name brings you on board?
It was definitely a milestone, but I went through lots and lots of bands, and I had my own little, you know, rewards during that process as well. Even as small as I remember auditioning for bands, and there was a moment where I went in for an audition for the band and I realized I already auditioned for these guys just a few weeks prior, and I turned it down. And I went back to this audition, and when I walked in the door, I was like, oh, hey, you guys are getting this. So they were like, nice guys, great guys. It just wasn't for me. It wasn't my music. And that moment, I remember thinking when I walked out, I went, you know, I've got to the point now where I think it's me that's auditioning the bands.
You're making the call, yeah.
I'm making the decision what I want to do. Once I realized what I wanted to do, that was a big moment for me. And then playing with some great bands as well, and being able to step away and think, yeah, I'm really contributing something good here and I'm getting something great out of it. That was a great moment as well. Of course, playing with Simon was a great validation. That's like a stamp on there. It's like, yes, you're going in the right direction.
From then you got to write and race with Jimmy Page on material that I believe that would become what eventually became The Firm.
Yeah.
Tony Franklin, who ended up playing bass in that band, he's actually just from down the road in Derby.
Oh, yes, that's right. Tony and I are old friends through the Swan Song alumni, through Phil Carlo, who was Jimmy's tour manager at the time. And we still stay in touch. We're friends, and I think he'd been playing with Roy Harper. And then when I went off to work with Ozzy from Jimmy, then Tony came in and started playing with Jimmy. I stayed friends with Jimmy. It was great. He's a lovely guy. I love him.
I think at that time you said Ozzy had seen you on a TV show and reached out to audition. So there you were, jamming with Jimmy Page, one of the greatest, most influential guitarists of all time. And then one of the most iconic rock singers is on the phone asking you to try out for his band. Where was your head at that point?
Confused. I wasn't on TV with Jimmy. I was playing with another artist, and it was the one-off thing. I went to the audition And it wasn't like an overnight audition. It was an audition, and then there was some changes, and then come back, and then audition, and then some confusion that went on. And then eventually I got the, hey, you got the gig. So it was probably about maybe, I don't know, 3 weeks or so after then. And then I didn't know what to do. I was like, well, what do I do now? So, I mean, I had a huge amount of loyalty to Jimmy because I was a big, big Zeppelin fan. And I was very much in awe of Jimmy and what he did and his musicality. And Ozzy, I knew who Ozzy was. I probably wasn't quite as passionate about Ozzy as I was about Zeppelin. Growing up, it seemed to me that people would either veer to the Zeppelin camp or the Black Sabbath camp, and it didn't seem to cross over both. I might be completely wrong about that, but that was my perception of it. But there was no doubt about it. And Jimmy said to me, look, if you want to go on the road right now and work right now, then you do that. We're probably not going to be able to get anything going for at least X amount of time. And that was my decision process at the end.
You went to work on The Ultimate Sin, bringing the hit song Shot in the Dark, which was my first introduction to Ozzy too. Obviously, it was a massive hit in the UK, but I first saw the title when my friend had it on a t-shirt with Ozzy biting the head off a dove. And that's the first time I saw Ozzy Osbourne Shot in the Dark. You were like off and running with that. I mean, touring the US. For an outsider, that seems like a magical time to be doing that all across America around the mid-80s.
And that goes back to your thing about setting attainable goals. If you talk to some of the friends I grew up with, many times we would obviously do all kinds of things together. Sometimes we'd go on holiday. Sometimes we'd jaunt over to Amsterdam or go to Paris or whatever kids do. And sometimes some of them went to America. They went to New York. We're going to plan a trip to New York. Are you in? And I said, no. I said, I had this goal, and the goal was the first time I ever tour or visit America, I want to be touring in a big rock band, right? And that was not an attainable goal, but it was just something I used to throw around. And for some reason, I just declined. I said, I'm not going to go to America. I'd rather stay here and do what I'm doing. And so when that happened, I mean, I was kind of pinching myself a little bit. I was thinking, how weird for something like this to happen. I mean, it almost sounds very arrogant to say the first time I visit is under these conditions, but it sort of ended up becoming a reality. So it was a magical time for me.
Where did you fly into? Was it East Coast or West Coast?
First time we went to New York, I went with Ozzy, and we were doing some interviews, and he said, we're going to go to New York and do these interviews. The other thing is we're taking Concorde.
No.
Yeah. And I still have the, when you flew on Concorde back there, they gave you a commemorative gift. And I still have it's a paperweight, and it says Concorde and 10th anniversary. And it was an amazing experience. I mean, I love flying anyway. So I was just, this was great. Ozzy didn't like flying very much, I don't think. Made him kind of nervous. All of a sudden, he gripped my knee with one hand, and he was gripping it. I was starting to turn green, I was just having a great time. I'm looking out the window. I'm looking over here and there. It's quite an experience.
Unreal. But that tour brought you back to the UK to play the Monsters of Rock Festival in '86. Also on the bill were Def Leppard, Scorpions, Motorhead, and of course Bad News. Do you have any particular memories of that day, or was it a bit of a whirlwind?
It was a bit of a whirlwind. It was much faster than I thought it was going to be. I think we actually had a shorter set than we normally would play. I think it was just over an hour, and we typically play closer to an hour and a half. For whatever reason, I remember that it was a long, long distance between me and the front row. And by the time we got on stage, it was pretty dark. So you couldn't see quite how many people were out there. And the lights on top of that being quite bright made it even harder to see. And it was, as quickly as it began, it was kind of done. But I loved it. We had a great day hanging out with all kinds of people. And I spent quite some time talking to Brian May, which was a real thrill earlier that day. So I remember things like that. I remember that I think it was the first show that Rick Allen played with Def Leppard again. And the Def Leppard guys were all friends of mine. We'd all been quite close. And he had been preparing for this show. The drummer that they'd been using for rehearsals was a guy by the name of Jeff Rich. Jeff is a friend of mine. We've been in bands together and stuff. And he was actually, I think, in Status Quo at that time. And so he was standing in the wings, ready in case it wasn't going to work out. And you could see everybody was just standing in bated breath. And the minute that Rick started playing was just brilliant. It was such a feel-good moment. You could tell everybody was just this outpouring of just joy for Rick being able to sit there and play and sound so great. So that was probably the most magical thing.
How was it returning to Donington at the Download Festival all those years later with Last in Line in 2019?
Yeah, it took a while, but I loved it. It's always a very special time for me to, playing in England. It's really where I grew up. It's everything that I grew up with. It's my home. It's, I love British people. You see that over here when Brits get together, all of a sudden they start having a great time together, and it leaves a room full of non-Brits scratching their heads about what do they say? What do they say?
We mentioned Bad News, who were on at Donington, the fictional band created from the guys from the comic strip. Tell me about another fictional band, Black Plague, from The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. Well,
that was something that Vince Neil called me up about. We'd been friends I think we first met before I was even in Ozzy. They were in London playing at the Marquee, and somehow or other I met Vince, and we just hit it off. We sort of became friends back then, and then when I was playing with Ozzy, we became really good friends. And so he called me up and said, I got to do this movie, and you want to do it with me? He explained what was going on. I said, sure, I'd love to. You know, he was friends with Rennie Harlan, who directed it, and Joel Silver, who produced it. And I got to know Joel Silver as well at that time. We went out, we put this band together, and we were in this movie. An awful lot of filming time. Filming, you hurry up and wait. You know, you show up somewhere, and then you're there for a week and a half. One of the highlights, I think, was the stuff that we filmed at Red Rocks in Colorado. We got snowed into the hotel. And so we were stuck there, and us, Priscilla Presley, Wayne Newton, and I had a huge background in Americana 50s rock and roll, rockabilly, which I really loved growing up in my late teens. I loved all that music. So meeting Priscilla Presley was just like, what? She was lovely. And Wayne Newton was probably one of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. He's so gracious and such a sweetheart to people. I remember we were snowed in. There was an older lady who was working in the kitchen at the hotel. And she said, shuffling around saying, would it be possible to meet Mr. Newton? And I said, yeah. I said, come on out. He asked her what her favorite song was. And she told him and sat her down, stood up and sang her the whole song a cappella. It was brilliant. I mean, these are the things that are so great about what we do, about music and about the whole hospitality industry, where you're really taking people into a beautiful place and showing them, a little break from their normal day. To this day, I really love that aspect of what I do.
One of the things you're also doing at the moment is splitting your time between performing and also producing. You recently worked on the latest Prophets of Addiction record, Face the Music. Prophet's main man, Leslie Sanders, he's a real road warrior flying the flag of good time rock and roll, who you've known for a while now, I think. I think I first heard of him in the MySpace days. Where did you guys first meet?
MySpace, wow, remember that?
Yeah.
Bloody hell. Where did we meet? We met around the clubs of LA. I put a production company together with my best friend at the time, and probably still, Randy Castillo, by the way, whose birthday anniversary is today, 18th of December. He would have been 22 years older. Anyway, we started working with some local bands in LA that we thought were cool. And one of those bands had Les in it, and Les and I hit it off. And what I liked about him is that he's a great songwriter. He writes really great songs, writes great lyrics, and he's extremely animated and very determined about what he does and does it in his own way. And so over the years, I've probably been involved in every record he's done in some form or function. And this was one where he called me up and said, I think I've got the resources to be able to do an album from scratch in one place with one person, with one team, with one group. Let's do it. I said, sure, perfect timing. Let's do it. We cut the basics all in the room, with us all together. But then we took those basic tracks, basically the drums, brought them back to my home studio here, and then just worked on them very, very relaxed, without too much pressure and without a clock ticking. And that's how we did it. And Les is a bass player. And he said to me at one point, he said, you want to play bass on this? And I said, well, you want to play on it? He goes, well, yeah. He goes, it'd be better if you played on it. Oh, I like your playing. And I said, all right, yeah, why not? And it was fun. I was producing and playing at the same time, which means you have to be very, very nimble as you run from one side of the glass to the other side of especially if you're having an argument with yourself.
When do you like to put the bass down? I had a falling, well, I didn't have a falling out, but I had a bit of a disagreement with Susie Quattro on about when's the best time to put the bass down, either with the drums before everything else or put it in later on where you can hear what spaces are left for you. Where do you prefer?
Between 6 and 8 p.m. Again, it comes down to writing a line. If I do a session, sometimes I'll get sessions. And what I'll do before I even listen to the song, even if I haven't decided whether I'm going to do the session or not, but I'll plug an instrument in, whether I'm using a little practice amp or whatever, or I'm in my studio and start playing the track, and I'll just start blindly playing it and I'll record it, because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know the song. You're just going to follow something very, very instinctively. And I'm listening to everything that's going on and I'm just playing along with it. You're going to write that part. There are some things that are necessary to be there for me to write a meaningful part. I obviously need to know what drums are doing. I need to know what the melody line's doing. Basic chords, doesn't have to be finished guitar parts. And really, that's the best place for me to be. So scratch guitars, drums, and a scratch vocal, and I'm good to go.
Sweet. Do you like playing on other people's stuff? Does it push you to be more creative as a player?
No, but I think it's nice to play on other people's stuff, because then you get to play different types of music, different styles of music, things that you might not do normally or ordinarily, So I'll get to play something, there's some styles that, I grew up learning a lot of what we used to call jazz fusion as well. A lot of those bass players were huge influences on me. Ralph Armstrong, Tom Fowler, Jacob Pastorius, Stanley Clarke, all those people. And so you occasionally get an opportunity to use what you've learned there, whereas it might not fit in certain types of music. I've been doing quite a lot of work with Carmine a piece recently. We've done a lot of recordings together. And it's funny because he asked me if I wanted to play on something and I played it. He goes, I had no idea you could play that kind of stuff. And I said, yeah, most people only hear me playing this sort of stuff. And since then, he's been like throwing me all these other projects. So we really play well together. And I play with Vinny, his brother, of course, but they have very different styles as well. In fact, Carmine, myself, Michael Voss, and Paul Shortino just finished an album, which is really terrific. I know that Michael is shopping it around right now, but it's an amazing record. And everybody's playing and performances on it are just super exciting. And that's music, again, that's slightly different from what I would normally do.
What's next in the pipeline for you, Phil, for 2025? Hopefully coming back to the UK at some point.
Yeah, as soon as you do something about the weather, I'll come over.
I can't help with that.
Warm it up a bit. Come on. You've got to have some influence, Rob, right?
I wish I did.
No, we still have a fourth album to do, 3 albums in one EP. So we've got a fourth album to do with Last in Line. And we started working on that already. We've got our formative skeletal ideas in place, and that's bouncing around. There's going to be some delay on that because of Def Leppard's schedule and some other issues that are going on. But in the meantime, I started putting some more solo ideas together, and I'm looking at 16 or so possible songs, and I'm sort of finishing a lot of them. So I don't know, I might be in the market for another solo record pretty soon. So that'll be fun. Actually, Carmine's playing on one track. Vinny's playing on another track right now as we speak. I'm actually mastering the Prophets of Addiction album for vinyl. That's what I'm doing today. So that's going to come out as a vinyl release, which is cool. I love vinyl, and the reason I like it is it's such a collectible thing.
So Blank's music for your first guitar, where was your first album from back in the day?
It was called, I almost had it on the tip of my tongue. I don't know. It was in Kilburn. It was on the way to Kilburn from Maida Vale. And I went and bought something called Pure Gold on EMI. I don't know. That was a very strange record. I got given a lot of records, and a lot of the records given were typically classical. I'd really enjoyed musicals. Lionel Bart, Oliver Twist was one of my favorite albums for years. I loved Dickens. I loved literature. Those things I loved, and I think they influenced what I do. But the first band albums that I bought were Hunky Dory and Led Zeppelin 1.
You were set.
Right? What else could you possibly want? But Hunky Dory was a huge influence on me as well. And, Bowie back then was, I guess he would have been, in his early part of his career, was kind of like a folk writer. And then he started working with very unlikely people, and all of this creativity started coming out. And he continued that through his whole career. When you look at the people he worked with, I mean, even going from Stevie Ray Vaughan at one time and putting Stevie Ray Vaughan on the map. But people might have scratched their heads at times and said, well, why would he work with a blues guitar player like that? Or why would he work with, many of the people he worked with? So I think the creativity comes always from mixing styles which are not necessarily immediately obvious.
Yeah, and push yourself. Yeah. Phil, thank you for chatting with me. I'll let you go, but I want to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you. Well, Merry Christmas to you too, Rob, and happy holidays to everybody. Hope everyone has a wonderful New Year, because Lord knows the last few New Years, I'm starting to get a little nervous as we come around to New Year now.
Thanks so much to Phil Soussan for chatting with me on the very first episode of 2025 right here on the Straight to Video podcast. Be sure to keep up to date with him at philsoussan.com or find him on Instagram at Phil Soussan. So things continue to get busier at our 80s video shop over in Alfreton, Derbyshire. We've been making a few changes, moving things around, and even shooting a new film over Christmas. And along with that, we've just announced our very first special guest of the year. So on Saturday, the 31st of May, we will be welcoming actor and voice artist Charlie Schlatter to the shop. Charlie starred in some great 80s movies, from 18 Again with George Burns, the Chris Columbus movie Heartbreak Hotel, and he also starred alongside Kylie Minogue in The Delinquents. He played the role of Ferris Bueller in the TV spin-off of the John Hughes classic, which also starred Jennifer Aniston, and since then Charlie has become a hugely in-demand voice artist in the cartoon world, lending his talents to The Flash, various Transformers and G.I. Joe characters, and what is super cool, which I'm excited to learn more about, is that he was actually the voice of E.T. in the awesome holiday reunion short film and commercial from a few years ago, so he's certainly going to have some stories to tell. So please keep an eye on updates on the 80s Video Shop's social media, as along with a signing we'll be having a Q&A and a special movie screening, so make sure to pop Saturday the 31st of May in your diaries and look out for more announcements soon. So that's it for this episode of the podcast. Thanks so much for sticking with me, and until we chat again, make sure to always be kind. Please rewind and unwind, and I'll speak to you all real soon.